The air inside the Senate Judiciary Committee chamber felt thick with tension. Cameras clicked, aides whispered, and senators exchanged uneasy glances. What was supposed to be a routine oversight hearing had just transformed into something entirely different, a constitutional showdown. At the center of it all sat Justice Harland, calm but visibly uneasy under the lights. Facing him across the long mahogany table was Representative Rivera, a former constitutional attorney whose sharp legal mind had already gained her a reputation for dismantling flawed arguments with surgical precision. "Justice Harland," Rivera began, her voice steady but edged with purpose, "you've stated repeatedly that your recent ruling strengthens states' rights. But can you explain how limiting voter access, particularly in marginalized districts, aligns with the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment?" The room went silent. Even the hum of the cameras seemed to pause. Harland cleared his throat. "Congresswoman, the Constitution leaves certain powers to the states. My ruling simply respects that boundary." Rivera leaned forward, eyes narrowing just slightly. "Boundaries are one thing. Barriers are another. The 14th Amendment wasn't written to protect state power. It was written to protect citizens from state abuse of power." That line, sharp, precise, and grounded in constitutional doctrine, hit its mark. Murmurs rippled through the room. Legal analysts on the press bench exchanged quick notes. They knew what they were witnessing wasn't political theater. It was a constitutional reckoning. "With all due respect, Justice," Rivera continued, "if the states can selectively decide who gets to participate in democracy, then the Constitution becomes optional. And I don't believe any of us were sworn in to defend an optional constitution." The chairman's gavel struck once, a warning for order, but it was too late. Rivera's words had already made their way across every newsroom ticker in Washington. Rivera challenges Supreme Court ruling, calls it a threat to equal protection. Congresswoman confronts justice in historic hearing. Harland adjusted his glasses, visibly searching for footing. But Rivera wasn't attacking, she was dissecting. Every point she raised was backed by case law, historical precedent, and constitutional text. To those watching at home, it felt less like a congressional hearing and more like a courtroom duel, except this time, the roles were reversed. By the time the chairman called a recess, Rivera had accomplished what few in Washington ever did. She forced the country to question the foundation of judicial accountability. As the cameras zoomed in on her calm expression, one journalist whispered off-screen. She didn't just question the court, she reminded it who it serves. When the recess ended, the tension hadn't faded, it had evolved. Reporters were whispering, aides were typing frantically, and legal commentators were already calling it the most consequential congressional exchange in years. But Representative Rivera didn't seem fazed. She sat quietly, flipping through her binder, as if preparing for another day in court. That's what this felt like to her, not politics, but a constitutional trial. "Before we continue," she began, "I want to make something clear. This isn't about undermining the court. It's about ensuring the Constitution is applied equally, not conveniently." The words hung in the air like a challenge and a warning. Rivera had spent her life in the trenches of constitutional law. Long before she ever ran for office, she was a civil rights attorney, arguing cases in cramped courthouses, defending voters whose rights had been quietly stripped away by bureaucratic manipulation. She wasn't molded by politics, she was forged in precedent. That experience became the foundation for her latest legislative proposal, the Federal Voter Protection Act. "This bill," she explained, gesturing toward the committee, "doesn't take power from the states. It ensures that the power they do have is exercised within constitutional bounds. The 14th and 15th Amendments weren't suggestions, they were corrections." Justice Harland adjusted his glasses, studying her closely. "Congresswoman, your bill assumes the federal government can define fairness for all states. Isn't that the very kind of overreach the framers warned us about?" Rivera smiled faintly, not mockingly, but knowingly. "The framers also warned us about tyranny, Justice. That's why they created checks and balances. The federal government isn't claiming authority here, it's fulfilling its responsibility." Her answer wasn't fiery. It was precise. Each sentence grounded in constitutional logic, not ideology. Several senators nodded. Even a few opponents couldn't help but acknowledge the force of her reasoning. Behind the cameras, one analyst whispered, "She's not arguing politics, she's reinterpreting the Constitution in real time." To many, Rivera represented something Washington rarely saw anymore, a scholar who spoke like a citizen. Her legal mind was sharp, but her language was human. She didn't bury her points in jargon. She laid them bare, where every listener could see their meaning. The Constitution was never meant to be a wall, she said, looking directly at the audience. It was meant to be a bridge between freedom and responsibility. This bill keeps that bridge standing. The chamber fell silent again. Cameras zoomed in. The moment felt bigger than the hearing, as though history was taking notes. Even Justice Harlan seemed to pause, not because he had been defeated, but because he had been challenged on the same moral ground he once claimed to defend. As the chairman called time, Rivera gathered her notes. A nearby aide leaned in and whispered, "That was incredible. You just reframed the whole debate." Rivera gave a small, calm smile. "No," she said softly. "I just reminded them what the debate was supposed to be about." The hearing resumed after a brief recess, but the atmosphere had changed completely. What began as routine oversight had become a national spectacle, a battle of constitutional interpretation now unfolding in real time. News networks had cut to live coverage. Hashtags were trending. Legal scholars from Harvard to Howard were already dissecting Representative Rivera's earlier remarks, calling her framing a constitutional masterstroke. But inside the room, Justice Harlan wasn't ready to concede the narrative. He adjusted his microphone and leaned forward. "Congresswoman Rivera," he began, "I appreciate your passion. But if we start allowing the federal government to dictate every aspect of elections, where does state sovereignty end? The founders placed limits on federal authority for a reason." Rivera didn't rush to respond. She let the question hang in the air, making sure every camera, every senator, and every viewer had time to hear it and feel its weight. Then she spoke, calm and deliberate. "Justice, with respect, sovereignty ends where inequality begins. The Constitution wasn't written to protect power, it was written to protect people. And that protection doesn't stop at a state line." The audience stirred. The phrasing, crisp, moral, unyielding, was the kind of statement that cuts through political noise and goes straight into history books. Harlan tried again, this time invoking James Madison and Federalist Paper No. 45, arguing that state powers were numerous and indefinite, while federal ones were few and defined. Rivera nodded politely. "Yes, Madison said that. But he also said, and I quote, 'Justice is the end of government. It is the end of civil society. When states act unjustly, it is the federal duty to intervene.' Madison believed in states' rights, not states' wrongs." A low hum of agreement filled the chamber. A few senators even smiled faintly. Cameras caught Justice Harlan's brief hesitation, the kind of pause that told everyone watching he wasn't just debating, he was rethinking. Rivera continued. "The founders gave us checks and balances, not to preserve power, but to prevent abuse. The Federal Voter Protection Act doesn't erase state control. It ensures state control doesn't erase citizen rights. That's not overreach. That's constitutional repair." For the first time, the justice didn't interrupt. Analysts later described the exchange as a turning point in modern constitutional dialogue. One veteran journalist tweeted, "Rivera didn't just win the argument, she rewrote its terms." By the time the chairman called for closing statements, it was clear, the hearing had shifted from defending policy to defining principle. Justice Harlan, with a tone far less combative than before, offered his final remark. "Perhaps we all serve the same Constitution, even when we disagree on how it breathes." Rivera nodded, the faintest smile on her face. "That's all I've ever asked for, Justice, that we let it breathe for everyone." And with that, the hearing ended. But the debate had only just begun. Outside, the media swarmed. Headlines blazed across screens nationwide. Rivera redefines federalism in historic hearing. Justice Harlan and Rivera spar in constitutional showdown. The day Congress spoke the language of law again. Back in her office, Rivera placed her notes on her desk and stared briefly at the Capitol dome glowing in the dusk. The fight for constitutional equality had always been uphill, but for the first time, it felt like the ground was shifting. The law, she whispered to herself, isn't words on parchment. It's a promise, and tonight, it remembered that. By morning, the entire country was talking about her. Clips of the hearing had gone viral. Students were replaying them in law schools. Pundits were arguing them on every major network, and even retired judges were calling it a rare moment when law reclaimed its dignity. Representative Rivera arrived at the Capitol before sunrise. She wasn't there for the cameras or the headlines. She was there because the next step had already begun. The Federal Voter Protection Act was scheduled for markup, and every line of it would now be read through the lens of last night's debate. In the committee room, aides whispered updates from the press. CNN calling it a masterclass in constitutional ethics. The Times says she out-argued a Supreme Court justice. Public approval for the bill just jumped 20 points overnight. But Rivera stayed silent, reviewing the text of her bill one last time. She wasn't celebrating. She was preparing. The real victory wasn't in applause, it was in legislation that would endure. When the session began, several senators who had previously opposed her proposal began speaking cautiously in support of at least parts of it. Even those who disagreed admitted it had moral clarity, something Washington rarely saw anymore. One of them, Senator Albright, turned toward Rivera during debate. I may not agree with every clause, but I can't deny the intent. You reminded us what this body is supposed to protect. Rivera nodded respectfully. The Constitution doesn't need to be rewritten, she replied. It just needs to be remembered. That line made headlines before the day was even over. As debate continued, something unexpected happened. Justice Harlan himself released a public statement. It wasn't an apology, nor a concession, but something deeper. In a republic of laws, dissent is the breath of freedom. Yesterday's hearing reminded me that the law must always evolve toward equality, or it will erode into privilege. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement the nation had ever seen from a sitting Supreme Court justice after a public rebuke. And to those who had watched the hearing, it felt like a quiet surrender to truth. That evening, Rivera stepped outside onto the Capitol steps. The sun was setting, streaks of amber and violet cutting across the marble dome. Reporters were shouting questions, lights flashing from every angle, but she stopped for just a moment and looked toward the horizon. An aide beside her said softly, the vote's tomorrow. Do you think we'll win? Rivera didn't answer right away. She smiled faintly, eyes still on the fading light. Win or lose, she said, the Constitution already did. That night, as the nation waited for the vote, one commentator summed it up best on live television. Rivera didn't just challenge the court, she revived the spirit of the Constitution. History won't remember this as a clash between branches of government, but as the day the law found its moral compass again. The next morning, Washington stood still. The Capitol dome gleamed under a pale blue sky, but beneath that calm, the air pulsed with anticipation. The Federal Voter Protection Act, Rivera's bill, was up for a full committee vote. Inside the chamber, the atmosphere was electric. Senators whispered in clusters, journalists filled every available seat, and the nation watched live as the clerk began to call the roll. Senator Albright. Aye. Senator Reeves. Aye. Senator Milton. No. The count was razor close, a mirror of the country itself. For each aye, a cheer echoed from the gallery. For each no, silence cut the air like glass. Rivera sat still, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. She had argued in courtrooms, debated with justices, and faced political storms before, but this moment carried a different weight. This was about legacy. Senator Lawson. A pause, then, aye. Gasps swept through the room. That one word shifted everything. The balance tipped. The chairman leaned into his microphone, voice echoing through the chamber. By a vote of 11-9, the committee reports the Federal Voter Protection Act to the full Congress, with recommendation to pass. Applause broke out, first polite, then unstoppable. Cameras flashed. Reporters scrambled for statements. Rivera closed her eyes for just a second, letting the sound wash over her. Not triumph, relief. A reporter shouted from across the aisle. Congresswoman Rivera, is this a victory for your party? She looked up, steady and resolute. No, she said. This is a victory for the Constitution, and for everyone it protects. The quote became an instant headline. But what moved the nation wasn't the words, it was how she said them. Without arrogance, without celebration, just truth. That night, as the Capitol lights shimmered against the river, newscasters replayed her closing statement from the hearing, the one that had changed everything. Sovereignty ends where inequality begins. The Constitution wasn't written to protect power, it was written to protect people. Across the country, professors called it the Rivera Doctrine. Law students began quoting it in essays. Civics teachers played her speech in classrooms. And in that quiet shift, from debate to doctrine, history made its decision. Rivera returned to her office long after midnight. The city was asleep. She stood by the window, watching the faint glow of the dome. Her aide entered softly. Madam Chair, he said, they're already calling it a turning point. Rivera smiled gently, eyes still fixed on the horizon. It wasn't a turning point, she said. It was a correction, the one the Constitution's been waiting for. She turned off the light, her final words echoing in the stillness. Justice doesn't belong to history. It belongs to the present, every time we choose to uphold it. And with that, the door closed. The nation didn't just witness a debate that week, it witnessed the day the law spoke, and the people finally listened.